John Meacham, and I'm the editor of Newsweek. Before we begin, in remembrance and commemoration of the terrible events in Blacksburg, we would like to ask Imam Hindi to offer a prayer.
Let us take a moment of silence. In Hebrew, Baruch Hashem Adonai Eloheinu Melech Haolam. In Arabic, Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. In English, blessed is the name of God, the Lord of the universe. The eyes are with flowing tears. The hearts are molded with sadness and fears. About the mother student seized from her little two babies, and about the son and daughter expected back home in the summer. In the midst of a man-made tragedy, the minds wonder about why do we have those terrifying moments in our lives? And why are rage and anger shaping relations within our human family? The answer may not be that simple, yet we can still come to experience God's love in the midst of a calamity. We may still need to respond to God's call by becoming true members of one family. We can still join those voices of sanity and overcome the voices of hate. And we still can train ourselves to master the art of listening as much as we master the art of talking. Almighty God, to you we belong, and to you we do return. Almighty God, comfort us all, and lead us with your wisdom and love. Here at Georgetown, there at Virginia Tech, and in this great nation of ours. May those who drink from the well of hate come to taste the waters of harmony. The dominion is yours forever and ever. Amen.
This is an unprecedented joint venture between three great institutions, Georgetown University, the Washington Post, and Newsweek, or as I like to say, Newsweek, the Washington Post, and Georgetown. But that's a New York bias within the Washington Post company. So we are honored and flattered by your hospitality. I am known, as President Kennedy once said when he was in Paris, he said, I'm John Kennedy, and I'm the man who escorted Jacqueline Kennedy to Paris. I'm John Meacham, and I'm the man who escorted Sally Quinn to cyberspace. Otherwise, I just follow along. We, at Sally's instigation, we began the website On Faith within Washington Post and Newsweek.com. We now have over 100 panelists, marvelous people, who, from all faith traditions and no faith tradition, who are really dedicated to the proposition that we can shed light on issues of a religious nature rather than simply generate heat, which seems to happen all too often. And that's the mission of the site, religion being the most pervasive and least understood force in global life. And it's also the mission here today. And we hope this will be the first of many such conversations in order to understand things that are mysterious but really need not be. We're grateful to the Center for Muslim and Christian Understanding and the Berkley Center for their academic guidance and expertise. I see my colleague, the religion editor of Newsweek, Lisa Miller, is here. And David Waters is blogging, the producer of On Faith is blogging all of this right now. I wonder if I just say, David, will he blog that? His mother will enjoy that. And we're very honored to be here. We are journalists who are dedicated to what Philip Graham once called producing the first rough draft of history. And we found, as this century has begun, that that draft is going to have an enormous element about faith and reason, conflict between the two, and we're delighted that such a marvelous institution as Georgetown would be so welcoming to us. With that, I'd like to introduce our moderator, Professor John Esposito, who is the Professor of Religion and founding director of the Center for Muslim and Christian Understanding. Thank you.
Then the second thing I would do is remind David and John rather that the first shall be last and the last shall be first. Finally, I'd like to here in the back. How's this? I hear mumbling in the back. Okay? All right. As we begin this program, I think it's important to keep in mind the changes that have occurred within a short period of time in the U.S. America's religious landscape, its religious pluralism, has been transformed dramatically since the last decades of the 20th century. Perhaps the most dramatic change has been the growth of Islam and Muslims in America and Europe. Today, Islam and Muslims are the second or third largest religion and community in the West. But the Muslim population of America is far from monolithic, and we'll see this today. Muslims make up a mosaic of many ethnic, racial, and national groups. They are immigrants and their descendants, as well as indigenous African Americans. Like other religious or ethnic minorities before them, Muslims face serious questions of faith, identity, and culture. Today's panel brings together a diverse group of Muslim panelists in terms of religious orientation, race, ethnicity, gender, and age, at least in a few cases. I want to launch this important dialogue right away, but let me underscore the word dialogue. This is not an academic lecture. These words, academic lecture, was suggested actually by somebody else. But for those of us that are academics, it brings the hair up on the back of your neck. I'm not sure what an academic lecture is. Although there are a couple of colleagues here who I do think engage in it. Not only do we invite our panelists to challenge and engage with one another during the next hour and a half, we invite and encourage all of you in the audience to do the same. However, please don't make your way to the microphones until we've had a chance to pose some initial questions. And that'll be about 20 minutes from now. I also want to underscore the fact that we have an absolute ban on speeches. As Leslie Gore said, it's my party, and so I will define that. Those of you who are old enough to know what this line is, I'll try if I want to. I just use the first line with my students because they don't know the song. But the reality of it is that we really want to have this interactive, and that means being very, very brief. You'll see this in the opening round, because the panelists are going to have precisely 2 minutes to answer the first question that comes to them. John Bowles already laughing at that idea. So it gives you an idea of the problems that we're going to have today. On the other hand, we really do want to have a very robust debate, and so I'm going to encourage our panelists to jump in once we're into the program. So we're going to have the first round with the panel. We'll have some other introductory comments. We will be going to the audience. We'll have some blogging, and it will be dynamic for a good part of the program. But initially, it'll be somewhat structured. The theme, as you know, of the symposium is what it means to be a Muslim in America. Is being a Muslim a spiritual journey? Here we have the answer.
Okay. Shall we open this?
Yes. Is it a spiritual journey, a moral compass, a political point of view, or is it a culture apart? Hadia Mubarak, you're the first woman to be elected president of the Muslim Student Association of North America, and a doctoral student at Georgetown. We should reverse the order of magnitude on that one. How do you think 9/11 has affected the American Muslim community?
Well, First, thank you for inviting us to this panel. I think the experience of American Muslims was like the experience of all Americans in that our sense of security as a nation, and especially for my generation, was literally shattered on that day, and we're still struggling to piece together the fragments until today. On the other hand, I think American Muslims were confronted with a sense of perpetual displacement in the American public psyche. Although most of us were born and raised in this country and really knew no other place to call home, we came to realize for the first time that many Americans did not in fact perceive us as American, as truly American. And as our religious beliefs became a reason for our incrimination, as we were receiving reports of hate crimes against Muslim places of worship and against Muslim organizations and businesses, and as we were perceived as potential threats to the security of our own nation, I think our very sense of identity as Americans was perceived or regarded with mistrust and scrutiny. And I think it was a wake-up call for Muslims in America that we really needed to reach out to the wider public to stand up and represent ourselves. I think we realized that our failure to speak up on our own behalf would only result in a backlash against the Muslim community. And after 9/11, we realized how real that threat was, because people were being physically assaulted. You had cases of people literally getting shot. I mean, just a few months ago in California, Hadia Mubarak, who was picking up her children from daycare. So I think we realized how real the threat was and how much of an overwhelming responsibility we each had to play individually and collectively to educate the public about Islam and to educate our own community about the true teachings of Islam. And I think Muslim community leaders did a really great job with reaching out to law enforcement officials and really adopting a zero-tolerance policy when it came to extremist ideology or hateful rhetoric within mosques, within schools. And I think, then I know I need to wrap up. So I think it was a wake-up call, and I think also Muslims realized they really needed to speak up on their own behalf, because if we didn't, there were many people out there who were willing to speak on our behalf, whether it's Muslim extremists or whether it's right-wing bigots who want to depict Islam as inherently violent.
Thank you. I think I should also mention, and this is my own personal opinion, one of the things that you will see is that in this kind of forum, part of what we're trying to talk about is to give people a sense of what Islam and Muslims are experiencing, what they're about, and a lot of the questions that will be raised are the kinds of questions that people are asking. Some of you may think, well, why are these questions being raised and why are some other things not being discussed? But that's part of where we're coming from. Just so that we also set the groundwork here. This means wrap up. This means I'm cutting you off. So just so you know,
what's the wrap up? I didn't see that.
Wrap up is this. And I find that most people, when you do a panel, tend to do what students do. You know how when you're going to call a student, you may go like this. Well, I find that when I say something like that, then the panelists tend to do that. They talk and don't look at it, so they don't see it. But Sherman Jackson set an example for us. Professor of Islamic Studies at the University of Michigan, and visiting professor of law, and a national Muslim leader. Can Muslims fully integrate themselves into American society? Is assimilation the ideal, or are there other alternatives?
Wow. Well, first of all, again, thank you for inviting me here. That's a huge question, John, and I'm an academic, and to deal with this in all of 2 minutes is going to be a really big challenge.
I know you can do it.
Yeah. I would like to start out, though, by first of all problematizing the question, because I think that the very manner in which we ask that question could be explored in ways that will reveal deeper and more meaningful aspects about where we are as a nation in terms of how we're looking at this situation. And I'd like to try to make at least three comments on that. First, if I were an African-American Christian preacher, I don't think that there would be any question of whether or not I should be worried about assimilating into America. The assumption would be that I'm a black American Christian preacher. But the fact that I'm a Muslim, I think, raises the question. And I think that, one of the things we have to think about here is that Muslims are Americans like everyone else. And I think that if the meaning of the civil rights movement, for example, and the whole quest toward freedom, really meant anything, it meant being able to live the life that one saw fit to live. Otherwise, it's a very counterfeit of freedom. So I think that asking the question of whether Muslims can integrate into American society, we have to ask whether we're asking something about Muslims or we're asking something about American society. That's on the one thing, on the one hand. Secondly, I think that the question itself about assimilation, well, that depends on whether we look at America as a political arrangement or economic and political arrangement, namely capitalism and democracy, or we see America as a culture. If it's a political economic arrangement, then we can talk about assimilation into democracy and a capitalistic economic order. If we see America as a culture, on the other hand, then we enter into questions of, well, who defines that culture? And what is that culture? And what is the level of necessity in terms of assimilating into that culture? Which leads me into my third point. I think that also in asking this question about whether Muslims can assimilate into America, we tend to engage in a certain level of essentialist thinking. That is to say that Islam as a religion, in all of its aspects, cultural, religious, etc., is one black box entity. Is one black box entity, and therefore we have to think about, well, how we can modify that entity in order to fit into another black box entity, which is America. I have a totally different approach. Islam has always been very comfortable with absorbing indigenous cultures everywhere it went. And so the idea that somehow this is a brand new situation is very alien to me. And what I would advocate, which I always do, is the indigenization of Islam, whereby Muslims themselves have to be very careful in going about the business of creating a culture that resonates within the dominant sort of milieu of America as a whole.
Thank you. Ingrid Mattson, you're professor of Islamic Studies at Berkley Center and the first woman to be elected president of the Islamic Society of North America. What do you think about the way Muslim women are portrayed?
Well, portrayal, that's such an important word because it's the issue that we face constantly as Muslim women. This image of Islam, of Muslim women that is projected that we're always trying to work against. And let me just say, what does it mean to be a Muslim woman in America? Well, for me, it means waking up in the morning and looking in my suitcase that I brought in from the airport last night and hoping that some of my clothes are unwrinkled enough that I can put them on again and go to the airport. That's my priority. For my friend who lives in New Haven, her priority is she doesn't have health care. She has a son with a chronic disease, trying to find a doctor who can treat her son with his complicated situation. For another friend of mine who is a physician, who's been calling me and saying, I have these concerns about Islamic ethics in my work. How am I going to really integrate my beliefs about Islam and what's right and wrong with my work as a physician? Another woman who called me the other day and said, my husband has been waiting for his green card approval for 6 years now. Our family is in limbo. We don't know how to plan for our future. So each woman has a different issue. But when we come and interact in society with others, we're being treated as a collectivity, as Muslim women who represent a certain experience, a negative experience. And when we want to talk about what's important to us, whether it's access to health care or the immigration system or public policy and a broad perspective, we're being distracted by, I read a book about some woman in Pakistan who, her brother tried to kill her for an honor killing, and you Muslim women have it really hard, and it's an experience that has no relevance to our lives. Yes, we're not parochial, we care about justice issues, but we want to define ourselves, and the difficulty is to be constantly portrayed as a member of a collectivity that is essentialized, that is given this definition, this very superficial definition of oppression, that simply distracts from the real issues that we face.
Thank you. Salman Ahmad, you're a physician and a rock star internationally. How can technology and pop culture help shape the dialogue between America and the Muslim world? Or organic?
Thanks for it's great to be on this panel. Georgetown, UC, Washington Post. Having me. For me, technology and pop culture has always been a vehicle for putting out messages, musical messages of how we can connect. Because as far as I can remember, my family moved to the United States when I was 11, and what I loved about America was this pluralism, and being in a garage band with an Irish Catholic bass player, a Jewish American keyboard player. It informed me and also gave me a process of dialogue. That dialogue I carried through when I was in medical college in Pakistan, to take back my experience of America back to Pakistan. And when I formed my band, I asked my teenage friend Brian O'Connell to join me in Pakistan. And the music we made was what drove it. Really was the celebration of humanity, which as a Muslim comes from my understanding of Islam, which is informed by three very important, strong women. My grandmother, Aziza, my mom, Shaheen, and my wife, Samina, who really shaped my worldview of Islam. And you know, as a Pakistani American, I understand the Sufi understanding of Islam, which is, again, I'm putting a name on it, which is really experiential Islam. That when you see with the heart, all the masks fall down. So through pop culture, YouTube, MySpace, videos, documentaries, I've done 2 documentaries after 9/11. It's My Country Too, which is about Muslim Americans, and the other is a journey into Pakistan titled The Rockstar and the Mullahs, which is BBC came out with that title, which looks at the role of music within Islam and the multiple arguments that it throws out. So I think it definitely can today, because anything that happens, negative or positive in the world, is kids. I have 3 boys, and they can watch it on YouTube or MySpace. And for the Muslim identity, which I think it has been largely underrepresented in the mainstream media in America, it's crucial that these technologies are used.
Thank you very much. Yahya Hendi, you are the Muslim chaplain at Georgetown University, one of the clearly first major appointments as a Muslim chaplain in the United States full time. Can American Muslims be a bridge between the Muslim world and the West?
Without any doubt. However, I want to make a comment. So far, many of us said the word Muslims in America. I really object to the term Muslims in America. I think we need to call it American Muslims or Muslim Americans.
Muslim America.
Why we call Muslim Americans or American Muslims for me?
Muslim America. I'll explain that later on.
Question building.
We can use some of that too.
However, for me, calling Muslims in America may suggest that Muslims are in America temporarily and they are going back home. We are not here temporarily. We are here to stay. We have been here since the creation of our country, and we will continue to be here forever. And though there are some Muslims, some American Muslims or Muslim Americans who may feel that they are going back home, is what I call the myth of return. However, the majority of Muslim Americans are here to stay, and this is their country, and we are a part of the fabric of America. As to the question you asked in half a minute, I would say American Muslims are very sensitive to the national security of America. We care about America, we care about the interests of America. However, we have an advantage over our fellow Americans, and that is we know the Muslim world. We know the Arab world, maybe more than our fellow American neighbors. And therefore, we can play that role to bridge the gap between the East and the West, or between Muslims in the East and Muslims in the West, or between America and the West and Islam, or between Christianity and Islam. So Muslims have that role to play because they care about both worlds, because they know the language of both worlds, and because passionately they care about both.
Great, thank you. And Sherman, I know you'll bring us back to it later, so I'm not going to stop now because I think it is important to get out this question of Muslim Americans or American Muslims. Lisa Miller, you're Newsweek's senior editor on religion and society. Do you think the media does Islam justice in reporting stories about Muslims? Yeah, the audience answer first.
I think we're doing a lot better than we did. I was remembering when we said hello before this conference started, panel started, that I used to work at the Wall Street Journal 10 years ago. I've been covering religion for 10 years. And, I would call John on the phone, and it seemed to me like he had nothing else to do than answer my calls, and I really didn't have that much to do but call him up on the telephone every once in a while.
We both have pretty boring lives.
There were probably 3 full-time religion reporters at major national publications at the time. It was backwater, and religion stories tended to be, oh, those quirky people who believe in God, here's a little funny subculture, or very reverential, mostly Christian sort of religion pages. And 9/11, as Hadia said, changed all of that. Religion became front and center as a topic, and Islam became front and center as a topic, and those of us who were in the business and those of us who entered the business at that time realized we knew almost nothing about this religion. And we had to learn really, really fast. I was talking to my friend Paul Barrett, who just wrote a really good book about Islam. He used to work for the Journal. And he said he remembered sitting at his desk on page 1 of the Journal, like thinking, what do these words mean? What is a mullah? You know, what do any of these words mean? How do we interpret them for a lay audience? How are we going to do this right? And so our initial approach was, you know, in the wake of 9/11, to think of Muslims in the same breath as terrorists, and because that's what we were dealing with. And I would say that 6 years on, we have learned a lot about Islam, and we're doing a lot better. And I am increasingly convinced that the Muslim community is like every community in America, a community of like as diverse as Catholics, as concerned with questions of assimilation and not assimilation as Jews, and that we are doing much, much better at sort of painting Islam in all of its diversity and nuance. If you look at the Pulitzer won by the New York Times this week, that's a very good example of somebody who was paying very close attention to Islam in all of its complicated facets. So we could do better. I think we are doing better.
Thank you. Sally Quinn, first of all, I understand you have a comment from Talal.
I do. I'm going to get to that in just a second.
Okay. Do you want to answer the question, Muslim American or American Muslim? Okay.
No. I do not. I'm not going there. Most of you don't know, John Esposito and I just came back from a 3-week trip around the world to study the Great Faiths. Not alone together. We were with about 8 people. And for the last year and a half, I have been reporting and studying and reading about religion, and certainly since 9/11, there have been a lot of concerns about Islam that there were not before. I had a very different view of Islam until I started reading about it. And I have to admit that my view of Islam was rather negative. Since I've been reading and studying and also listening to a lot of the great lectures that John gave on this trip, and also being in a number of Muslim countries and meeting Muslims, and I've traveled all over the world and I've met many Muslims over my life, I began to see how difficult it is to be a Muslim in this world, and particularly to be a Muslim in the United States, because I know that what we see in the papers and the actions of a few do not represent the tenets of the Muslim faith. There are still a lot of negative perceptions there. For instance, when I told people that I was doing this panel and that I was actually going to bring up some tough questions, somebody said to me, well, aren't you afraid? Aren't you afraid that they'll put a fatwa against you? If you don't know, a fatwa is a ruling. Right, okay, yeah. Salman Rushdie had a fatwa put against him. But I mean, I was, and the person wasn't joking. They just said, well, this is really scary that you would stand up and ask them these questions. Yesterday, I did a Washington Post online live chat with Ingrid Mattson and Hadia Mubarak, and many of the questions were very blunt. Hadia responded to one question by saying it's incredibly important to distinguish between the teachings of Islam and the actions of Muslims. And then she went on to say it would also be unfair to judge Christian beliefs and teachings by the actions of some Christians. The readers weren't satisfied. One person said, look, you can quote the Quran until you're blue in the face. It doesn't matter what people should believe, it matters what they do believe. And another one said, I've read the Quran and I believe it does support many peaceful initiatives, so why isn't there an Islamic Reformation to bring it into the new millennium? Last week, there were several conversations by satellite with the Muslim Oxford theologian Sharif Ramadan, who was also an on-faith panelist. He did a guest voice for us on faith, in which he said, Muslims alerted to this highly charged atmosphere and deepening suspicions naturally complain and criticize the racism and daily discrimination they must endure. But in the final analysis, nothing will change until they accept full responsibility for themselves, become constructively critical and self-critical, and respond to the creeping evolution of fear with a firmly grounded revolution of trust. And here is what one reader responded to Ramadan. And I will read this to you because it represents everything that I have heard in my last year of reading and reporting and talking to people about Islam. Here's what this person wrote in. There is no lack of dialogue between civilization and Islam. There has always been dialogue. The problem is not dialogue. Islam is not compatible with contemporary values and human rights. Present civilization is based on human rights, secularism, and rationality. Islam rejects them all. Islam does not respect human rights. Islam pursues Sharia law that is based on desert rules. Islam doesn't respect Christianity and other beliefs. On the contrary, Islam insults Christian values. Islam doesn't respect men and women equally. Islam degrades women. Islam doesn't respect rationality, but advocates literalism and dogma. Islam doesn't respect freedom. Islam embraces subjugation. A woman has no right to divorce her husband, and a woman has no right to show her unwashed hair. A headscarf is the mark of subjugation and being a third-class person. Islam doesn't know what democracy is. There is no constitution in Islam. The Quran is the only book. Islam does not know what love is. Islam is based on hate and fear. Islam does not know what diversity is. Islam is based on brainwashing. Muslims must worship in the Arabic language 35 times a week, 5 times a day. The solution is not dialogue. Islam should be reformed and must urgently come into the 21st century. Islam ought to adopt civilized values. And clearly these are not my views, but as a reporter, they are representative of what I hear all too frequently. And I think the problem that many non-Muslims have in this country are that they feel these questions are not being adequately answered. And to make matters worse, there's the constant drumbeat of media stories on Islam in the paper. Even today's Washington Post, there are 2 stories on page 24A. One was a report of a Muslim assailant in Istanbul that slit the throats of 3 Christian Bible sellers. And the other was about the latest bombing in Iraq yesterday, which killed 158 people. Sabri Hassan Ali watched a man's head being blown off. His voice filled with outrage, he asked, why are they targeting the innocent people? What is their guilt to die? And another man running by screamed, curse Islam, what kind of Muslims kill their own brothers? And these comments and stories are all heartbreaking, and yet they only emphasize the perceptions that many people in this country have about Islam. So I ask you all, panelists today, and also those of you in the audience, what must it be like to live with these perceptions about your faith? What must it be like to be Muslim in America today?
Thank you very much.
I'd like to jump in if possible.
Yes, but it's going to be very brief because we have to set up the audience. But I know you can be very brief.
Well, I just wanted to make a comment on something Lisa said with the media. I mean, one problem I have with the media as a Muslim American is the depiction or characterization of Muslim religiosity as somehow un-American. And Sherman Jackson also referred to this. You know, This is, I mean, I think the media is doing a much better job, relatively speaking, to a few years ago in depicting the diversity of Muslim life in America. But at the same time, you know, obviously there are statistics and whatnot regarding that Muslim Americans are becoming more religious, more observant. There are more young Muslims like myself who are covering their hair. There are more MSA chapters. There are more mosques and Muslim schools. But at the end, you know, of every article I read that sits there and accurately describes this growing religiosity among Muslims is that, well, ultimately it's somehow a departure from American culture. And I have a serious problem with that, because I think until we address this root, you know, perspective or paradigm that considers Islam itself as alien to American culture, then we will never be, you know, perceived as fully American. Because I think to depict my decision to cover my hair as a rejection or departure from American culture is like saying that if a Baptist girl decides to become serious about her religion and decides to attend youth group or decides to go to a Bible study, that's somehow a rejection of American culture. It's exactly equivalent, in my opinion. You know.
But part of the problem then is that there are two sides of this, and I think that one of the mistakes that Muslims often make is that we're willing to accept the onus of dealing with the Islamic side of the equation, but we leave the American side sort of unchallenged. And that is to say that we accept this notion that there is some American culture. I mean, who's American? Snoop Dogg, or Jerry Falwell? I mean, which represents American culture? And I think that one of the things that Muslim Americans have to do is they have to get inside of this whole construct and make their contribution to the furthering of the commitment to American pluralism, because we are a pluralistic society. And so there's not one American culture, there are several. And I think that we have to make our contribution to sustaining that.
Okay, it's going to be really small.
It has been very painful after September 11th to live with all of these stereotypes about Islam and about Muslims. However, to be honest, I think America in general responded very positively. Many of us, I believe every one of us, has been to churches and synagogues and schools speaking about Islam. I know that in the last 6 years, I spoke at more than 90 synagogues nationwide and almost 1,200 churches around the country, because there is this desire within America to know the truth. And
yeah, but there's a coordinated campaign against that openness, and that's where these ideas come from. The people that are saying this thing are responding to literature that is ideologically oriented by political and religious extremists outside the Muslims who hate Muslims and who are spinning these lies. I mean, how does a woman respond to a statement? Oh, you're a prostitute. You are loose. I mean, how can you defend yourself? That's what I feel like when I hear these things. You're full of hatred. I mean, how do you defend yourself? And where do those ideas come from, except from a deliberate campaign to poison people's minds against Muslims, because of this outrage?
As American Muslims, we need to align with our Christian brothers and sisters, our Jewish brothers and sisters, to reach out, to counter that campaign against Islam. We need to speak in churches and synagogues. We need to publish more. We need to be on TV more. We need to write more. I think that can help.
Good. Very close to this. As we segue into the next part of our program, could I ask those of you that are interested to please make your way up to the microphones? And as you're doing that, let me just ask John Meacham a question. John, you have expertise in religion, and your book, American Gospel, is a great read. I say that because I actually read it. Well, thank you. I also get 5% of his royalties when we agree on it.
You're welcome to say it if you hadn't read it as well. But,
say that. Yes, that's right. Good review is better than. But what I wondered about is, as I read your book and I thought about the whole American relationship of religion, the way it's developed. When we talk now about the question of relations between Muslims and non-Muslims and how Muslims assimilate in terms of American society and American culture. From your point of view, what kinds of observations did you have about this issue?
well, there were many important phrases. Two phrases stick out in my mind. You mentioned feeling permanently displaced in America, and you raise, what is American culture? You know, James Madison said that religious liberty was the luster of our country. George Washington, in a great letter to the Hebrew congregation at Newport, said that the government of the United States should give to bigotry no sanction, to persecution no assistance. He alluded to Micah and said every man should sit under his own vine and fig tree, and none should make him afraid. I think that there is a long and noble tradition in this country, sometimes honored in the breach, but by and large, a good story about people of divergent faiths and no faith, but actually divergent faith more often than not, coming together and finding a way to live together, to worship as they please, and to form a prevailing culture, I think. And I think that it's the duty of the religious person, particularly now, to defend that liberty, almost as a theological virtue. If my view of this is that if, I'm sort of a low rent, say Augustine on this, very low rent, that if God himself did not compel obedience, then no man should try. And I think that we have a good start on this. We screw up, we do terrible things, we have been miserable at times. But by and large, I think religion has been a force for good. And I think it's religion. I would actually, I would ask you all, atheists I talk to and confirmed secularists feel much less at home than I think Muslim Americans sometimes do. Because people share, I think there's an expectation in the prevailing culture that people of faith, in a way it doesn't really matter what the faith is, people are more comfortable knowing that the other person has a faith and has some values that are connected to the sense of the transcendent. Oh, that's an observation.
We have to go to the audience, but I will just make a quick comment. That last part that you mentioned, I'm on the blonde situation that you have, and discussing the question of religion in the media. What surprised me was somebody that had interviewed me in the past wrote to me and said, the one thing I disagree with is that you didn't mention, nobody mentions, that atheists and secularists are not taken seriously today and don't have to fight the place. Everybody talks about, discrimination against Muslims. There are Roman Catholics that feel they're discriminated against, but, how about our voice? But in any case, as we go, please make sure that you turn the mic on when you go to speak. And could each person identify yourself when you ask a question, then I will refer to members of the panel. Yes.
Yes. My name is Imam Khan. I've been Muslim for over 35 years. And the question, what is it like to be Muslim in America, is somebody saw it. And to the organizers, we do hope that you would consider diversifying your panel to include more of the indigenous Muslims in America. I think that you will get a better understanding and a better representation of what Al-Islam is like here in America. My question is to the Washington Post and Newsweek and other of the mass media. Why is it when Islam and Muslims in America are presented in the mass media, indigenous Muslims are rarely mentioned, and they are seldom asked their opinion on world events, especially as they impact the Muslim world and America? Would someone please answer that question?
Something I was going to say in the opening remarks that I didn't say was that the only story about Islam that I did write before 9/11 was about indigenous. That in the collective consciousness of American journalists, I think the African American Muslims were the only Muslims we knew of. We weren't paying attention to the other Muslims either in America or abroad until 9/11.
Say something. Just, it took a long, long time for most newsrooms to understand that Christianity might have a denomination or two within it. A hell of a long time, so to speak. I think that Lisa and I have talked about this a lot. In the most recent iteration of this, you had Mel Gibson's The Passion. You had the moral values exit polling coming out of 2004. You had Billy Graham coming to New York, where many of our colleagues in the mainstream media learned that there were these people called Christians who lived in the country and had driver's licenses and other things. And there's been a kind of growing sophistication about Christianity. I think it's a lot better. I think the coverage of Christianity is a lot better than it was today than it was 10 years ago. We have a huge way to go on exactly the issue you raised, sir. And it's going to take us, unfortunately, it's going to take a long time. But what you should know is that by and large, people's hearts are in the right place in those newsrooms, understanding what we don't know and that we need to find out.
I think there's something. I think there's something else to it, which is that when people think of Muslim, they think of foreigner. They think of, and I don't know where I fit in that because I'm indigenous and I'm white, but when they think, okay, let's get the Muslim voice, they don't picture an African American at all. They picture, they're thinking of the so-called Muslim world. I don't know what the Muslim world is. This is my world, and I'm Muslim. So even that term, it doesn't make a lot of sense to me, and I don't know if it makes sense to Sherman.
Just from a journalistic point of view, you cover what the story is, and since 9/11, the story has been about Muslims who are not in this country. The story has been about Afghanistan, and it's been about Iraq and the Middle East, and so I think that's why there's less coverage.
Yeah, but Sally, to ask about the events in Iraq or the events in Afghanistan is one thing, but the story has been Islam.
Yeah, that's right.
And that's part of the problem. And that's what we're referring to.
But what I'm just talking about daily things that happen on a daily basis that you would report on. Those are the stories that are the most that happen, that are there every day, that are on the news and that you read about, and because that's something that's happening. I'm not saying that that's good or bad. I'm just simply trying to give an explanation why the concentration has been on Islam outside of this country.
Well, John will give me more time. I want to read something else, but I'll be good.
How can I resist? Go ahead.
Well, I just think that around this issue itself, I mean, there's a big, gigantic polka dot elephant in the room when we start speaking about these issues. And I think that one of the things that we perhaps need to come to terms with is the psychological space from which we as Americans, certainly the dominant culture in America, approaches this issue. I think that Islam has been racialized. And I think that has made it more easy for it to become an other. And I think that also we tend to talk about issues of religion in America as if religion constituted the kind of fault line that race did. I mean, John, you mentioned Washington's statement at Newport about not the American government will give to bigotry. No sanction
to persecution doesn't.
Racially? I mean, and that's part of the point that I'm making. I mean, we have a racial fault line, and there is also a religious a rift. And I think that oftentimes, when thinking about America and what really divides us and what really categorizes us, I'm not sure it's as much religion as it is race. And I think that those religious communities that have been so successful in America, I think that even they would have had a very different history had it not been for the configurations of race in America. If Jews, for example, could not become white. So I think that in terms of understanding where our own prejudices come from, we need to acknowledge this in terms of what it contributes, perhaps, to the way in which we discuss the issue of Islam.
Yes.
Thank you. I'm Shepard Jenkins. I have 3 points to make.
I have to point this out that almost everybody does this. I've been doing this for 40 years. I have to point out that as a Roman Catholic, it's interesting to me that no matter what somebody's religion, they always have 2 points. Incredibly, if anyone was Regrettably, today we're going to be Unitarians. Today not regrettably, some of my best friends are Unitarians. I think we need to go with 1 point, otherwise we'll have a
I
problem.
have
You have a long line.
three interrelated points that.
In 1 minute, you'll get that. You'll get it in. Try it.
Protestant, the church came here for religious freedom. The comment about George Washington, we heard once and twice. What happened in America, even though it struggles for definition, is a pluralistic country. But the pluralism had a major principle that was a revolution in history. It was called the separation of church and state. The problem for my brothers who are Muslims, the fear that they feel or their discomfort, or the fear that we as Americans, including our Muslim Americans, may feel after 9/11, comes because we're not talking about religion. And I'll leave the question of race aside for the moment. The question in the minds of many Americans about the Islamic culture, is it a religious movement only, or is it a political movement? And what happens in America for our indigenous American Muslims is affected not by what we do here. It's affected by their brothers around the world, who in enormous numbers are politically active. And I'll leave the fatwa as a remaining footnote to that. That came from a political Islamic regime. It did not come from a religion per se. So my question is, if you want to feel at home here, we want to feel at home together. We don't know. Is this a religion or is it a political movement? That's my question.
Sherman and then
Well, I think that,
That has no meaning.
take that as a sign for God saying.
Okay. All right. Well, I would question the extent to which religion and the political dimension of life can be completely bifurcated. I think that, given what Ingrid said, there are some women who wake up and their issue is, how am I going to get the kids to school? There are others that say, well, how am I going to get health care? Now, that is a political issue in America. And they may draw on their reservoir of religious and spiritual life in order to promote that cause. But the question that you're raising about separation between church and state, I think that's the issue you really were getting at. Yes. I think that Muslims are certainly the classical tradition of Islam is very at home with that. Something a lot of Americans don't know. In fact, the religious establishment in Islam fought tooth and nail. Tooth and nail to remain separate from the state, to never have the state determining what the truth is and what can be imposed as the truth. So Muslims are very comfortable.
Historically or currently?
Well, you see,
I'm talking currently.
but currently, it's amazing. If Muslims living in America are going to take responsibility for everything that goes on in the Muslim world, who could stand up to that kind of a criteria? You don't take responsibility for what the KKK does, and I didn't give you that responsibility.
It's not responsibility, sir. It's the effect on your life here by what happens in the political agenda of the Muslim nations.
But this
But
is where I'm talking about collective.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, the second part, which is in pluralism. Now, pluralism is the oxygen that Islam has always had historically and needs today, because the first instance is the city of Medina. That's the place Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, moved away from his own tribe, a place where there were Jews, there were pagans, and Muslims, and that is the model for a Muslim community. Second, if you go to Muslim Spain, again you have diversity, pluralism. That's where Muslims developed. In the Mughal era, where you had Sikhs and Hindus and Muslims living together. So, come back to what you're saying, the 5 to 8 million Muslims who live in the United States hold the key to set the tone for a new Muslim identity for the rest of the world. And that's, rather than looking at how the rest of the world, the tone of the Muslim world affects Muslims here, it's the other way around, really. Because I think Muslims here are well integrated, despite the fact that 9/11 took place here, and despite the fact that, you know, it's been tough for the last 6 years. But they live very diverse lives, and they come from, it's a microcosm of the Muslim world. So they are potential U.S. ambassadors. 5 to 8 million Muslims in the States are U.S. ambassadors because they're a conversation with all the different cultures, Muslim cultures around the world.
I have to bring this to a close. Ingrid, you can have the last word.
Let me just say that there are those people who are out there spinning this fear that the reason why Muslims want to join American society or be part of American society is only a facade for them to take over and make the United States into some kind of Islamic state. That is so fallacious and hysterical on so many levels, I can't even start. I mean, we can't even get a board meeting in an orderly fashion, much less control the United States of America. But seriously, I mean, why is there that, why should we bear that fear and suspicion? Catholics in America were not affected by the fact that in Northern Ireland there was a politicized militant Catholic movement fighting for autonomy of those people. Neither were American Protestants burdened generally, and even Irish American Protestants burdened with this collective guilt and responsibility for answering for what was going on there, unless there was a clear link, unless there was, you know, there were clearly resources that were going to support illegal actions. So it's just, this is what I say is that the problem that I see is that Muslims are constantly being viewed as a collectivity, that somehow if you know one, you know them all, and that we have this secret, you know, somehow agenda that joins all of us for a mission, and there are people who want to convince Americans of that, and it's just not true.
I want to underscore something that Ingrid said at a meeting I was with Muslims. A Muslim from Chicago was saying how difficult it was to bring together a group of imams until he realized how you do it. He sent out a note and said to all of them that they were having an award ceremony, and that they'd all be receiving an award on that day. So sure enough, they all showed up. And I want to apologize. There's a mic back there, and I didn't realize it. Yes.
Is it mic here?
I know. We all have to suffer. Last shot first. Yes.
Thank you. My name is June Molina, and more than a year ago, I read an article in the real estate section of the Washington Post that surprised me, and it said that the Islam religion prohibits borrowing and lending money, as the Old Testament, as I know it, mentioned. And this prevents a lot of Muslims from joining that financial building part of American society where you create wealth through home ownership. And it seems to me, after reading this article, that the rules of the Muslim faith are causing the American Muslims to be marginalized by not allowing them to buy homes in the suburbs so their kids could go to school in the suburbs and go to scout meetings in the suburbs and do the stuff.
I know a lot of bad Muslims then, I'll tell you that.
So
real bad
I don't see the rules of my faith preventing me from becoming a part of the society in every way, shape, and form. If you go to Flint, Michigan, there are about 600 Muslim doctors who are very integrated in the system and very practicing Muslims. And the rules of Islam don't prevent them from doing so. The Muslims were active in the political community. In the Congress, there are almost 10,000 Muslims serving in the Department of Defense, in the military. And these are very practicing Muslims. And don't see Islam as a prevention from becoming very integrated. There are many Muslim businesses around the country as well. Don't see Islam as a prevention from becoming a part of society.
Let me just say about this particular issue is that Islamic law does not prohibit buying and selling or lending. The extension of credit is a long and sophisticated tradition in Islam. What Islamic law prohibits is the charging of interest. And so this is why Islamic law and and finance law developed all sorts of alternative mechanisms for lending money and extending credit. However, pretty much all of the scholars have given the fatwa, which is a legal ruling, that it's permissible in case of necessity in an economy that deals in this, if there's no other alternative, to buy a mortgage and buy houses based on a typical classical mortgage. And there are lots of Muslims who do that. But there are also alternatives, just as there are alternative lending procedures, co-ops, and other things in America. Muslims are developing alternative lending schemes that do not prevent the really poor from home ownership, and that also do not burden the very poor with excessive interest rates, where they end up losing everything that they have.
We have a question from the blog, from the website, and then I will take the second mic, which is almost impossible for me to see from here, so I'm glad you raised your hand. If I converted to Islam, then changed my mind, would I be allowed to leave? That's not my question. That's the question that we're getting from you.
The simple answer is yes. Islam gives us the right to choose the faith we feel comfortable with.
No, would I be allowed to leave? So your answer.
Permission.
Yes, you would have the right and the permission to leave the faith that at one point they professed and choose another religion.
How would you respond to those that say that there certainly are enough incidents in which that does not seem to be the case?
Well, there has been, I believe, abuse of the understanding of the rule of treason in Islam.
Sherman?
No, I mean, part of the problem here is that, Muslims in America today are under such pressure that anytime a question is asked, rather than simply explain one's answer, one feels this pressure to apologize, and to apologize in such a way that answers for every Muslim opinion that has ever been given about a specific issue. Yes, the questioner was asking about the rules of apostasy. And yes, there have been opinions to that effect. The question for us is, what is the dominant opinion now? And certainly, what is the dominant opinion among American Muslims? And it is, no, apostasy is not a capital offense. And that is not an apologetic posture. That is a posture that has been worked out according to the same rules and principles and the same sources and methodologies through which the other position worked out its conclusion. So, I mean, the answer is no. Are there others who hold other opinions? Yes, there are.
Okay.
And someone...
That goes back to the gentleman's question earlier, though. I mean, here in America, it's not apostasy, but overseas in Islamic countries, it is apostasy.
Excuse me, please sit down. If you have something to say, go to the microphone. You can be called on. Yes, sir.
Yeah, as someone, I'm not a religious scholar, but I happen to be a Muslim. I read the Quran, and the thing about the Holy Book is that I don't need for somebody else to tell me what I'm understanding. It's processing through my own intelligence. And when it says there is no compulsion in religion, I accept that as being that if I believe in the tenets, and if it's moving me experientially, then I am a Muslim. But if it wasn't moving me, I don't have a pope or some other authority or mullah to go and prove that I'm, I am a good Muslim, yet I don't believe from within.
Yes, my name is Imam Yahya Hendi, a Pakistani Muslim, and my question is about, one question is to the Islamic scholars, and the other question
No, one question.
Okay.
We're Unitarians, remember that. Go ahead.
So it's a related comment. My question is that, why do we Muslims think that somehow, if we have a glass of wine, we would lose our religion, or if we, go to a Bible study group, we would lose our religion? I think this is the real way of integrating people, or just making them understand our points. And the example I could give during September 11, I used to be a part of Bible study group at NCC, National Community Church, where Ashcraft grows. And those people were really very upset then, and I sent them very critical of US foreign policy articles, and they weren't, they took it. The reason that, and their views are not different what Sally just read from a piece of paper, that's how these Muslim Christians believe about Islam. But I think when you try to become part of them and try to understand their point of view, then they would, understand what you are saying. So my point is this, that we need to, these people, those Bible study groups can be described as a right-wing extremist. But to me, they are not right-wing extremists. If I try to understand their point of view, they would try to understand my point of view. So I think we should stop these name-calling and try to understand that we are all, children of Abraham. And that is the way to bring people together.
It seems to me that that's not a question, so we'll let that statement go. Hadia Mubarak, I want to ask you a question, and then we'll come back to the audience. One of the things that I have found, and many people have found since 9/11, in almost any talk that you give, in addition to there being a question, let's say, about women in Islam, one of the questions always asked is, why don't Muslims speak out against terrorism? Why are they so silent?
Well, that's a great point. The thing is, obviously, there are numerous websites. All you have to do is Google, Muslims condemning terrorism. I mean, every prominent scholar in the Muslim world and in the U.S. and throughout the world has actually condemned terrorism. There's been a fatwa against terrorism. I actually have a copy of the fatwa right here, which was actually published by the Islamic Council the Fiqh Council of North America. And actually, it's a great fatwa that explicitly delineates a couple of things, that you cannot, obviously, terrorism is absolutely forbidden in Islam. It violates the basic tenets of Islam, and that it's haram, forbidden, which is the highest category of prohibition for anyone to even endorse or support anyone who's engaged in terrorist activity. So it's a very strong fatwa. But I think, going back to the comment of the earlier gentleman, the previous question, is that the most fundamental problem, I think, today with the U.S. and the Muslim world, and when I say Muslim world, I mean Muslim majority countries, is that we tend to blame all attention on religion. We tend to view current relations through the prism of religion when the tensions have nothing to do with Islam or with religion whatsoever. There are legitimate. First of all, we fail, I think, and I have to blame the media somewhat for this as well, is that we fail to explore the historical, social, economic, political landscape of the Muslim world and ask the question, why? Why is there this growing anti-Americanism? Why, what are the grievances? And you find out that, it really has nothing to do with Islam, period. And that's why, as Ingrid mentioned, our experience and our reality is very different in the U.S. because our social and cultural reality is different. I don't have to go through any curfews on my way to Georgetown or checkpoints. My reality is different, and that's why maybe I cannot, when you ask the question, when the previous gentleman asked the question about political and whatnot, no, every Muslim individual, wherever you are in the world, has a different reality and different priorities. And for Muslims in America, our priorities are like the priorities of most Americans. They're diverse, and when they come down to them, it's really a part of the context in which we're living. And so I think really when we speak about the U.S. and the Muslim world and the current tensions, we really need to look at the other factors, the historical, the history of colonization, the current political reality of authoritarianism, of political repression, of the fact that globalization is getting the rich richer at the expense of the poor. And these are the conditions that are exacerbating, the growing anti-American sentiment. And really, for us to purely look at current international relations through the prism of religion is absolutely, misleading.
My name is Dave Rogers. I'd like to pose this ecumenically. It is conventional wisdom, particularly promoted by a chap named Stephen Emerson, that the Saudi government massively subsidizes mosques and madrasas in North America, and therefore the brand of Islam that is predominant there is a branch colloquially known, I suppose, of Wahhabism, which is viewed as singularly odious. Now, to what degree is this assertion correct? And if it is correct, how does it stand in the way of the desire for integration in which we all seem to believe in? Thank you.
I must point out that he was waiting so patiently that I didn't ask the following question, which was going to occur right after your question. Have most immigrant mosques in America been funded by Saudi Arabia or other foreign funding? What is the impact of this kind of funding? So, you're right on the channel. Anybody care to address that question on the panel?
Let me just say that this is, when people make allegations like this, there's a responsibility of due diligence on those who are hearing it and passing it on, and the media, to check if that's factually accurate. It is just inaccurate. It is not true. The books of mosques and Islamic organizations across America have been audited. They're open. They can be examined. So to throw out a claim like this is just absurd. It's not true. Our organization, for example, the Islamic Society of North America, is supported by our membership. Broad base of membership, thousands of people who provide our funding. We receive no foreign funding. And that's true for most mosques. What is true is that, especially in the 80s, that there were many Muslim communities who did not have the money to build mosques, looked to wealthy donors wherever they were for funding. And they went and really quite, I might say, promiscuously, just you know, if someone had money, they took it because they wanted a building. They wanted to build a mosque, they wanted to build a school. And I don't think that meant influence. It meant that donor was able to give something and they got a building out of it. But it's, when we look at the way that Muslim Americans practice their religion, when we look at surveys that have been done by Professor Ihsan Bagby and others of attitudes of Muslim Americans, we see that they're primarily and overwhelmingly in contradiction to the kind of values that are characterized as Wahhabi, which are narrow, anti-pluralistic, anti-women, anti-democratic, etc.
Anybody else like to? Yeah.
I just want to add that actually many communities tend to think that to prove yourself in the field, don't accept donation from outside your town. We just finished building a mosque in Frederick, Maryland that cost $2.3 million. Not a single penny came out of Frederick County, Maryland. And it's the case in many communities around the country. Yes, we try to go sometimes out to other cities, and some people do that. But people really try to depend on local funding, local help from local men and women, not outside.
Thank you.
But,
there was somebody at the mic there. No, excuse me.
How about here?
Were you at that mic? Okay.
Can't hear.
His hands are mic right there.
My name is Nazan Cooper, and I come from an Islamic country and Islamic family, but we were taught that religion is the affair of the heart. And the founder of the country decided some 90 years ago that religion and government affairs should not be mixed, and caliphate was abolished. And my generation, we thought that this should be the case, that religion, government affairs should be separate. So when I came to this country, as a secular person, I was really disappointed. It was a very, very religious country. And on top of it, nobody was curious enough to ask me what Islam is all about. I could have told something. There was totally no curiosity. After 9/11, everybody wants to know about Islam. But if they come to me, they would hear a different version of Islam. Because I don't believe covering our heads. It's nothing to do with Islam. I read Quran, I read the Bible. There's no such thing. When I, well, okay, coming to my question. I am very much concerned about young people. Sometimes they're having economic problems, educational, social, psychological. They turn to religion. as an identity or as a source of strength, and they do become radical. Yes. In fact, I'm alive here because I was lucky to escape from Al-Qaeda's attack in Istanbul a few years ago.
Okay. Would you like to address that as?
Yeah, I'd like to address that. I mean,
not the only one person on the panel.
Obviously, we are a secular society, and I think as a secular society, we need to advocate for certain principles. And I think one of those, and we need to advocate for them consistently. Whatever religion, and excuse me.
We're a secular society, we're a secular government.
We're a secular government, exactly. I mean, we're a secular government. There's a separation of religion and state. But I mean, what I'm saying is that when it comes down to religious practice, I mean, the principles we need to advocate are freedom of choice, freedom of religion, freedom of dress. And, you know, as much as it is your right to, you know, decide not to cover your hair, and I have the utmost respect for that decision of yours, I have just as much of a right to decide to cover my hair. And if we're going to premise freedom, if you're going to premise my liberation upon me renouncing an integral part of my faith, then what kind of pluralistic and free society is that? And in my opinion, Turkey is the reverse of the Taliban. Because if, you know, there's no difference to me. I mean, if we're going to advocate consistently for the freedom of women to choose how to dress, then in my opinion, the Taliban's, you know, decision to compel and force women to cover is just as condemnable as Turkey's, you know, decision and policy to force women to take their scarves off in university and in any public office. I've been to Turkey a couple of times, and I literally saw women walking before me with wigs. I mean, how bizarre and how dysfunctional is a society where a woman wearing a scarf like I am before you is seen as a threat to secularism or to your freedom. I mean, I think what we need to advocate for consistently is the freedom of all people to decide what they want to believe, to decide how to live their lives, to decide what to wear, and we need to advocate for that consistently. Whether, you know, and I respect that everyone has a different interpretation of Islam. But just as some Muslim women believe that they don't have to cover, I think we should equally respect the fact that some Muslim women, as myself, believe that I should cover. And in the end, it's a personal thing. It's between me and God. And I think a free, pluralistic society should respect that.
Yeah. You know, this secular component, I think Islam, because we see it as a Muslim, as encompassing the universe, all the laws of the universe, and society and culture. If you take the affirmation of faith, the Muslim affirmation of faith, which is La ilaha illallah, meaning there is no God but God. Now, somebody like me, I translate that into come to faith with skepticism. Try to seek truth with skepticism. And it says, you know, the affirmation is that if you come with honest intentions and seeking truth, you will arrive at truth. There is no God but God. So people who have a secular perspective of life, and whether they want to have hijab or they want to keep a beard or they're as you know, all the cosmetics that Muslims try to show their faith, project their faith with, I think that's just cosmetics. Faith is inside the heart. And I don't think women cover their heads or don't cover their heads, or wear a skirt or don't wear a skirt, should be judged as good or bad Muslim.
Second mic, please.
It's going to have to be extraordinarily brief. So
it'll be a question, I promise.
Good. And start with the beginning of the question. Thank you.
Okay, this is for our panelists from the media. Why is the mainstream media, in fact, infatuated, in some cases glorifying fringe individuals, and I'll name a few who supposedly represent Muslims or Islam and reformation of Islam. For example, Salman Rushdie, Irshad Manji, Ayan Herzi, Asrar Nomani, I could go on and on. Why this infatuation? And to give you a little context, I'll ask another question. Would you look at Ayn Rand or Sam Harris as proponents of Christian Reformation?
Sam would.
You know, it's funny because the people I know in Christian circles ask the same question about Jerry Falwell and Pat Robertson. They say, why do you guys, every time Pat Robertson says something, why do you guys, you know, print it? Why do the cable stations go on about it all day long? And the fact is that, as Sally says, you know, the story is a story, and when Salman Rushdie runs into the kind of trouble he ran into, you have to report the story. The other fact is that these people, the people that you mentioned, have made themselves visible in a way that other people are not. Going back to what I said originally, I think we're getting better at exploring the nuances of Islam, as we're getting better at exploring the nuances of other religions. And it's up to us to find the imams, to find the scholars, to find the stories like Ingrid is talking about, you know, the daily stories that are going to bring home to our readers what the true experience of, you know, American Muslims, did I do that right, is like. But, you know, as John said, it's a process.
There are two complications here. One is, Lisa's exactly right. The media is not ideologically biased. We're biased toward conflict and a changing narrative. It doesn't much matter who's up. We're going to try to bring them down because we don't want to write the same story every day. I'm serious about this. There is the culture of the media, broadly put, is that conflict is the most inherently dramatic. I don't apologize for that because Homer thought the same thing. And it's a very good project for someone to go and look at the covers of Time and Newsweek, the front page of the Washington Post, the front page of the New York Times, over the course of a year, and tally up the number of martial metaphors. The battle over X, the war for Y, X versus Y. So that's, to answer your question most directly, sir, that's one of the reasons we go to predictable voices. Now, we are doing everything we can. One of the reasons for this, for On Faith, actually, is to give moderates a voice. Michael Kinsley, our colleague from the New Republic and Washington Post and Slate and other places, used to say that when he got called by a TV booker to talk about an issue and he didn't want to do it, he would say, oh, I'm of two minds about that. And you could hear the booker going through the Rolodex to find the next person. Because the last thing you want is, well, here are the three things about that. Sorry, so that's what they, the other part of this is you can't shut down Reverend Falwell, you can't shut down Reverend Robertson, you can't shut down Franklin Graham, because if you're for free speech for the moderates, you gotta be for free speech for the more caricaturable figures. It's our responsibility to make sure that on the whole, the portrait of a different community, of an issue, is more balanced than, is balanced in such a way that we don't get questions like that. It's a good reminder of what we have to do.
John, I want to say something about that.
Excuse me for 1 second. I'm the one that's got control of the time. Sally.
It's the same question we get all the time about why do you only write bad news, why do you write good news? Because if something bad happens, you write about it. There are good things that happen all the day, but that's not the story. We could ask the same question about Don Imus last week and say, why are Jesse Jackson and Al Sharpton getting all of the publicity? Because they're out there, because they're speaking, because they're making a lot of noise. And I think that the people who will draw attention to themselves are obviously going to get more attention than people who aren't. One of the questions that was asked of John Esposito on this trip, and we've discussed it already, is why don't the good Muslims speak out against the terrorists and the bad Muslims and all of that? And as Hadia pointed out, and Neil and John pointed out on this trip, they do, but we just don't know about it. And one of the reasons we don't know about it is because they do it in a silent, they do it in a sort of gracious way rather than screaming and yelling, and so they don't get any kind of attention.
Well, I indict the media on that. So my interpretations are different. I tend to bring something else.
I tend to respectfully disagree, Salman, because I am one of those imams who have been very loud. And I know many imams around the country, many experts and experienced in Islam, have been speaking very loud and have been trying to reach out to the media. We send out our press releases. We pick up the phone, we call people, we tell them we are doing this, but no one shows up, no one comes out, no one writes about our story. Conferences of 30,000 people meeting in Chicago does not get well covered. Imams speaking against terrorism in support of our national security. And meeting at the National Press Club with 100 people does not get covered, but two self-proclaimed imams with only 13 people get covered everywhere and nationwide. So we have a question, a sincere question to ask, that we think that the media sometimes is not interested in covering our true voice of moderation.
We're going to have to bring this to the last two final stages of the program. Let me just follow up on something that John said about the fact that the media is interested in conflict, and I think that's the case. But I think that also what that means is that at the end of the day, when we had a major meeting in Amman, Jordan last year of major religious leaders, Reuters had terrific coverage. I wish I could say that about the American media. Yes. And that's been consistent when it comes to statements that are made by Muslims. But we will now segue into Salman, who's going to sing something for us and tell us a little bit about that piece. If you can't do it, several of us can step in.
Well, I mean, the tone of a really enlightening discussion for me is defining identity, you know, and Islam, Muslim American, American Muslim. There was a man by the name of Alwaleed who lived in what is now Pakistan in the 17th century. He was a student at madrasa, in Islamic school. And when he was 20, 21 years old, he was inside the mosque, washing his hands and his feet, getting ready for prayers. And he stopped and he asked his teacher, he said, what's the point of me washing my hands and my feet if my heart's not clean? And his teacher looked at him and he said, you know, these are rituals, and as Muslims, we cannot question. And Baba Bulleh Shah, who had a restless heart, restless spirit, he walked out of the madrasa, and he grew his hair long, he started to dress outrageously, and he became the voice of Muslims living in the subcontinent. But beyond the Muslims living in the subcontinent, he became the voice of the Hindus, Sikhs who revere him. He's the most, one of the most popular Sufi poets of the subcontinent. And at that time, the mullahs, or again, I use that term, intolerant religious scholars didn't even allow the proper burial. But the truth is, poetry resonates so deeply that today, every year, there's a celebration in his hometown of Qusur, where thousands of people come and celebrate his poetry. And one of his poems, one of his most powerful poems, is Who Am I? Ki Jana Main Kaun. And let me see my guitar works before I can read it. I'll sing it for you, I'll translate it. So Bulleh Shah sang this in Punjabi. I'll just loosely translate it for you. He says, I'm no believer in a mosque, and I have no pagan ways. I'm not pure, I'm not vile, I'm no Moses, I'm no Pharaoh. Who am I? Ki jana main kaun.
दूजा होर पछाना ओ बड़ा तेरा गुजारा हो ना कोई दूजा होर पछाना ना मैं बाका विच बलीता ना मैं बाका विच बलीता ना मैं मूसा ना फिरौन बुल्लिया ये जाना मैं कौन बुल्लिया ये जाना मैं कौन ना मैं आदमी ना मैं हाकिम ना मैं आदमी ना मैं हाकिम ना मैं आतिश ना मैं बोर ना मैं आतिश ना मैं बोर बुल्लिया ये जाना मैं कौन बुल्लिया ये जाना मैं कौन
Specifically on Sally's request, because I just came in this morning, and this is a pretty interesting setting to do this song. But thanks very much.
We had a chance to explore in new ways, and this opportunity will continue. Georgetown University, the Berkley Center, the Washington Post, and Newsweek will be holding a number of such forums looking at a variety of issues that cut across our religious landscape. For many of you in the audience who are interested on a regular basis, you also, of course, can go to the website on point. The one observation I would like to make now, before I turn this over to Sally Twin for the final word, is that I started saying in the last year, when it comes to Muslims and Islam, the following, that I have the best job in the world. For 30 years, it's actually more like 40, but I don't like to admit it, but for 30 years, I am asked the same question, same set of questions, all the time. Post 9/11, the same set of questions. We want to think about that. Stephen Prothero has written a book in which he talks about America's religious literacy. We have an irony here. America is such a religious country, and yet we get an F when it comes to religious literacy. But I think when it comes to Islam and Muslims, my answer would be the same that I gave to a young woman who I gave an F to for plagiarism, and she said, I don't understand this. I gave you 30 pages, and I got an F. If I had given you nothing, I would have gotten an F. And I said, well, if it makes you feel better, you have a 60 instead of a 0. And I think that one of the things that we're still challenged to in our country, which sees itself as pluralistic, is that we're a country whose pluralism is based on the Judeo-Christian and secular tradition, and how we incorporate the new religions that are not that new. Hinduism, Buddhism, and Islam remains a challenge for us, and particularly given the political situation in the world, how we interact and understand Islam. Now,
well, I want to thank our fabulous panel, all of you, for coming. This is wonderful. John, thank you so much for being the moderator. You're a killer.
this was a bad day. It was
John,
a bad day.
Thank you very much. And also I want to thank Tom Banshaw from the Berkley Center and Sarah Gorfinkel. And I would like to make a pledge to you, Imam Hendi, that we will, on Faith, devote 1 week to the good imams. You should be our moderator for that week, all right? Okay. And I would like to close with, I was reading a book recently by the Sufi poet Rumi, and I found this passage that I think would be a very good message for all of us to take away from this symposium. And it is, do not ever fight or argue, because for God there are no fights and no arguments. For that one, everything is love, Everything is in the form of love, compassion, and truth. May God provide you with the blessings and grace to live in that state. Thank you very much for coming.